So can I just say three words, which is just to welcome everybody here. There's been a tremendous response, and this is Paul Feldman's initiative. And we're going to have a proper big meeting in due course once the crisis is over. But there's been a tremendous response to this, and we have some really good speakers from quite a few different aspects of Ted's life. And Tom McDonnell's going to kind of round up. And we have a list of 12 speakers. So if all the speakers can try to keep it brief, if possible, please. So I'm trying to unmute Simon. Oh, there you are.
Yep, can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can hear you and see you now.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to speak. I first met Ted about 8 years ago during the campaigns against austerity in Lambeth. We would often be protesting outside Lambeth Town Hall, lobbying the councillors with Save Our Services, which was an anti-austerity group that was active at the time. We'd be picketing the Labour councillors and heckling them as they went in to vote for cuts. And he always struck me as such an incredibly determined class fighter right up to the very end. It was through living and working in Lambeth that I got to meet Ted and so many others from the 1980s and from his generation that really inspired me to start writing about the history of the borough from 1979 through till the early 90s, the kind of radical Lambeth period. And it started off as a history of the left-run Labour Council because I wanted to write it because there's so much myth and even outright lies about that time and about the kind of politics that the council had. That I thought it was quite important that we try and set the record straight a bit. One of the things I was looking at was, lots of people say about Ted Knight's time, that it was a loony left council, and kind of the loony left Labour was really stuck on Lambeth. Bill Shelton, the old Tory MP for Streatham, would call it the looniest council in the country. But it's really interesting if you actually look at what Ted and obviously so many of his comrades, some of whom are on the call here tonight, were trying to do in that time and the fight against Thatcher. It was really, it wasn't loony. Sorry to even use that kind of mental health term. That was the language at the time. But it was really ahead of its time. It was setting up race equality units, highlighting LGBT rights. All these things are quite standard now. And other so-called loony left policies that were associated with Ted's time, like twinning with Nicaragua. That was done out of solidarity with the revolution and after encouragement from Latin American residents of the borough. The nuclear-free zone policy, which was so derided in the press, that was designed to highlight the government lies about nuclear war. The Thatcher government at the time was saying that if a nuclear bomb dropped in Westminster, it would only cause very, very minor damage in Lambeth. And of course, everyone knew that was a lie. So I think all of these things at the time, which got such a bad time in the press, were really very important standpoints and struggles that people were waging. And Ted, of course, him and his comrades, I think that the story is very inspirational. It was a council that was willing to fight over rate capping until the very end, long after Ken Livingstone and Margaret Hodge and David Blunkett. There were some controversies, of course. Ted knew more than most that you can't build socialism in one borough, that you're still the head of a local government under capitalism. So inevitably there were conflicts with the unions, with squatters, with other left groups. But I think what's a real testimony to what was going on is that when the rate capping struggle started, all of those groups and unions came out to support the council and to join the fight in a united struggle against Thatcher. I just wanted to end very quickly with an anecdote that I've included in the book, which is...
Simon, sorry to interrupt 1 second. Patsy Cummings has just joined, Paul.
Okay, brilliant.
Right.
Just a quick kind of anecdote, which I thought was quite instructive of Ted as a person, that, he was drinking in a bar during the rate capping dispute with some of his comrades, and the person I was talking to that recounted this story said, that he had kind of like a moment of doubt, and he was like, well, this is such a huge struggle and I'm asking so much from so many people to potentially sacrifice so much in this fight against Thatcher. And when they told me that story, that was real insight to me, because obviously I knew kind of Ted, as that class struggle We know I feel sad that Ted hasn't got to see the book. It's coming out at the end of the year. I told him that I wasn't writing a hagiography. I wanted to include all the debates and arguments, whether I felt Ted was right or not. And he told me he wanted it to be warts and all, because there's so much to learn from all those different political fights and arguments at the time. I truly hope that the people that struggled in the 80s, that sacrificed, that dared to fight Thatcher in that time, can act as an inspiration for the future and for the struggles that we're all inevitably going to have to face over the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Patsy?
Just before Patsy, I'd just like to read out one of the tributes.
Okay, go on.
Okay, this is from Len McCluskey, General Secretary of Unite, who said, Ted was a true spirit and a fierce fighter for his class. I have been proud to know Ted for many years and to have been inspired by his leadership and socialist convictions. In recent years, Ted has been an active Unite community member, inspiring further generations to fight for social justice. Ted will be much missed, but in offering our sincere condolences on behalf of Unite, I hope the admiration and respect so many have for Ted will be of comfort. Goodbye, my friend. Sorry, thanks, Bill.
Right, Patsy, you can speak.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. I'm really, really pleased to be here and really honoured to have been asked to speak. I haven't known Ted for decades like many of you. I've only known him for maybe just under a decade, although it feels like a lifetime. Ted, to me, was one of those characters that you could see that he never, ever moved from his position in terms of standing up for the community, for what was right, for all the causes that many of us who came to this very late learned from him. He took all the fights on behalf of so many others. He, whenever I had interaction with Ted, he was adorable. And I know he wasn't that to everybody, but he was strong, he was firm, and I know the things that I was doing as a community organiser initially and got involved with Croydon Assembly, and later as I became a councillor. And he actually held me to task. He made sure that he held my feet to the fire as well. But he is one of those true people. There's not the right adjective, actually. He made sure that whatever was happening, he made sure that we all remembered what we should be doing that was on the right side of history. And he did that right up until the end. Very recently, he invited me to the Retired Unite Croydon Retired Unite members, and we talked about so many things, and obviously very, very active Unite members who had been fighting the struggle for so many years. And of course I was still going for the GLA seat for Croydon Sutton, and he made sure that everybody was there that wanted to support me, and he knew that if that's where I ended up, there'd been somebody else that was on the same side as most of us here in this room that would actually try to do the right things on behalf of the community moving forward. And he was just so staunch in the way he thought about things and the way he made sure, whether or not it was with honey or with vinegar, but he made sure he was always doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was or how difficult it was for either himself or the people he was trying to make sure did the right thing for the residents of whether it's this borough or whether or not it was London or whether it was for the community in this country. So Ted, keep shouting at us.
By the way, Patsy, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes.
Which I'm trying to ask you to turn your video on, and some people would like to see you. Oh, there you are. Brilliant.
Hey.
Oh dear.
Thank you, Patsy.
You're welcome. But yes, we've now got somebody who's going to be on our shoulders constantly to remind us that we still need to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it is. So thanks, Ted. Thanks for taking me under your wing. And thank you for all the things you've done over very many decades, most of it with huge, huge challenges. But I know all of us are going to appreciate him far more in the history books, and those that never met him will read about him there.
Thank you, Patsy. That's wonderful. Very much appreciated. So I'm going to mute you now, and I will turn off your video in a second. The next person is Carolyn Tyrer. Carolyn, are you there?
Hello.
Brilliant. And if you can turn on your video as well, that'd be great.
It says that the host has stopped it.
No, I'll just start it again. There you go.
Hey, hello everybody. Yeah, my name's Carolyn Tyrer, and I come from a slightly different perspective with Ted in that the Labour Party has been a huge part of my family's life when my sister and I were growing up, which included Ted Knight, who was a very big part of our family. When my sister Sharon and I were growing up until we lost touch and moved away to have our own families. But Ted remained close with my parents, Ken and Yvonne Phipp, who were both Labour councillors and active in Lambeth, and worked tirelessly with Ted to make a difference. Sadly, my parents are no longer with us either. But I've got many memories of Ted and thought I would share just a few I have as a child with Ted. And one I remember was when there was a general election in 1970. And my sister and I sat outside the polling station for hours, taking numbers down and running them back to the nearest rooms. Ted always used to come out and check that we were okay as kids, as he knew that we could get into it. And being children, filling our tummies was really important to us. So he used to sneak us sweets and crisps to keep us going. And he used to tell me to share with my little sister. I'm not sure I did that every time, so I'm sorry, Ted. I also remember helping, I also remember, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there because there's someone else's pictures up on front. I also remember when we used to have committee meetings in our own house in Carnac Street in West Norwood, and we were relegated to the kitchen as children to make large trays of teas and coffees for everyone. And Ted was the only one who used to come in and help us. He always carried the trays, as 10 cups on a tray for a 10 to 12-year-old was quite a feat. But it also meant that he got first dibs on the biscuits before everybody else got them. Ted had a great sense of humour and always looked out for me and my sister. He had a great way about him and used to get up to mischief sometimes and then wink at me so that I knew he was teasing his victim at the time. I met up with him again at my dad's funeral 10 years ago, where Ted delivered a great speech about his time with my dad, the rape happening in Lambeth that they were both involved in, and many other great stories that they went through together in keeping the fight for people's rights. Ted and I had kept in touch every now and then since the day of my dad's funeral until he sadly recently passed away. We will miss Ted. He was a dear friend. I can just see Ted and my mum and dad all sitting on a cloud together somewhere contemplating Labour Party membership as people enter heaven. So rest in peace, Ted. We shall miss you dearly. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. That's wonderful. Thank you very, very much. So next person on my list is Nick Toms. So Nick, I'm just going to try and... So Nick Toms, I'm just unmuting you now and asking you to turn on your video. Can you hear me, Nick? There you are. Great. Excellent. You need to turn on your... No, let me just unmute you. You keep muting yourself, I think.
Go on, Bill. I'll let you
Okay.
control me. Evening, comrades. I just wanted to say a few words really about Ted's contribution to really Lambeth, really from the time he was a councillor, really, because I was not that much involved in the Lambeth side. I was more in Liverpool back in the 1980s. But I moved to Lambeth in 2005, and whilst I've met Ted before then, really we started to work together very closely on a variety of different campaigns from that time. And Ted was certainly a very significant part, despite no longer being on the council, in the Lambeth Labour movement. One of the things we were involved with around that time was the Labour Representation Committee, which we both used to attend the national committees of, and also locally. And but, there weren't that many of us in those days. The Labour left was very much in the doldrums, but Ted was always there. And what always impressed me was that even though he was getting on in years, he nevertheless really put his heart and soul into all the campaigns we organised. He wasn't one of these people who just turns up and makes the speech and leaves again. Ted got his hands dirty with the rank and file all the way through. And sometimes we all had some great meetings. We had a meeting with John McDonnell, and John's another one certainly who falls into that category, who does that as well. We had a meeting with Mark Sawatka, and we had a great meeting with Bob Crow as well. And sometimes it might just be me and Ted stood in Lambeth High Street leafleting for those meetings, although they were very successful. And the LRC and the left really, was just one of the aspects of Ted's work in Lambeth.
2 seconds, Nick. Jeremy Corbyn just joined us from his garden.
Okay, hi,
left
Jeremy.
his video on for the moment.
Hi, I can see his garden. That was just, the LRC was just one of the things that Ted was involved with. He was involved in Unite, the pensioners movement, and of course the Labour Party. And really from 2015 onwards, of course, the left got a huge new lease of life in the Labour Party. And Ted certainly was one of the first to throw himself into Jeremy's election campaign back in 2015. There weren't many of us to start with in Lambeth. I can see a few names on here who congregated in my front room back in July 2015, June 2015, to get the campaign going. But as more and more people joined that campaign and then joined the Labour Party from 2015 onwards, Ted really, particularly for the new activists who were becoming on board, really became quite an inspirational figure, and he could always be counted on to support any of the socialist left campaigns going in the Lambeth area, whether it be a speech to a big meeting or whether it be a talk in someone's front room. Ted would be there, and the right, I'd have to say as well, continued to hate him right to the end of his days. One of the things that happened with Ted was that he became elected as an observer to a Lambeth Labour group from Dulwich and West Norwood Labour Party, and they were not delighted at all with that and tried every means to stop him going. And certainly one of the last things I did with Ted was drafting letters in my kitchen for him to send to the Lambeth Labour group and the leader to try and to answer the ridiculous reasons they were giving to prevent him from attending. Just for a personal level, I would say probably for the last 15 years, or certainly the last 10 years, me and Ted and certainly Paul and Sully left to go to York, used to meet up in Morley's to discuss various things, planning campaigns, analysing the latest political developments, or just reminiscing about the different organisations that we've been involved with in the past. Ted lived for the Labour movement. I mean, he had nothing other than, he had no personal wealth, no personal gain. He lived for the Labour movement. He was, in my experience, he was scrupulously polite. If you agreed to do something for Ted, you would get very polite phone calls. Excuse me, comrade, have you managed to do that quite yet? Is it possible you could do that for me, please? And of course, you always did. Polite, but absolutely implacable with his politics, and absolutely determined right to the end of his life, committed to the cause of socialism. He was a great comrade. Is a good friend, and certainly from my point of view, and I'm sure for many, he'll be much missed.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick.
Thank you.
And the next person due to speak is Julie. Do you want to read anything more out, Paul?
Yeah, I'll read another couple of tributes that I've got. some of them have already been published, but anyway, Mark Sawatka, General Secretary of the PCS Union, said, Ted was a giant of our movement. I got to know him quite well in recent years and was constantly amazed at his drive, passion and commitment, not just in the national stage, but also locally, where his work in the Croydon labour and trade union movement was superb. He was knowledgeable, approachable, dependable, and an inspiration. I will miss him. And one very brief one, Anne Lawrence. I knew Ted very well for many years, and I will miss him at meetings. He was a great encourager and supporter in whatever he got involved with. He was admired by many and will not be forgotten for his commitment to the community. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, so Julie is with us in sound and video.
Hello.
So to you, Julie.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Julie.
I'm Julie. I'm the CLP Secretary in Croydon Central. I've just written a few things about Ted. So I only knew Ted in recent years when I joined the Labour Party in 2016. At the time I joined, because I felt compelled to defend Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, in addition to being angry at austerity taking a hold of the country. And I was also angry at how Thatcherism damaged my life. So this culminated in my decision to become a Labour Party member. I was incredibly naive when it came to politics, and I remember attending my first ever Croydon Assembly event in the autumn of 2016. I learned so much, and I continued to attend as many events as possible. That's when I first heard about Ted. I just remember being struck by his fiery speeches. So I read up about his history at Lambeth Council and his long history on the left in the Labour Party, which for me as a left-winger was truly impressive. Fast forward a year or so from then, I was on the Croydon Assembly Committee in my capacity as an officer in Croydon Momentum and later as Trade Union Liaison Officer for Croydon Central CLP. With Ted's encouragement, I was able to help contribute to a People's Manifesto for Croydon in the upcoming local elections. I grew to respect Ted's passion and determination to create a better society through collective power, i.e. socialism. I remember his constant strive of bringing people together and empowering people. I remember he emailed me to congratulate me when I eventually became CLP Secretary. I'm so sad that we have lost him, especially in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. A lot of policies he believed in are needed now more than ever. The last time I saw him in person was at a rally I had organised for Richard Bergen in Croydon. I was so concerned about that event, whether it would go well or not, but Ted arrived early to help, and he was the one who encouraged me to chair it. I'm glad he did, as the rally went really well as I could have hoped for. So that is the memory I will take with me. His ability to include others, to strive for a world that really does work for the many, not for the few. That is Ted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Julie. That's really great. By the way, there are 73 people in this meeting now. I'm trying to find Samuel Francis, who's meant to be the next speaker. Is Samuel here?
I'm Sam, Bill.
Oh, Sam, right, great.
Yeah.
Right, so you're unmuted and I'm inviting you to start your video.
Okay, thank you.
There you are, great.
Everyone, just want to say what an honour it is to speak among comrades who knew Ted for much longer than I did. I'm the chair of Dulwich and West Norwood CLP currently, which is Ted's CLP. I met Ted in 2016 after moving to Dulwich and becoming more involved in the CLP. Ted was a titan of the Labour movement and a dear friend and comrade who spent his life fighting for the socialist cause. He will rightly be best remembered, obviously, for his role in the heroic stand taken by Lambeth Council under his leadership against Margaret Thatcher's assaults on local government. However, those of us who knew him locally will remember his enduring commitment and activity, as well as his fantastic sense of humour. Under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, Ted returned to elected Labour Party positions, and at the time of his death, He was the chair of Gypsy Hill Labour Party and the Trade Union Liaison Officer and the Lambeth Labour Group Observer for Dulwich and West Norwood. To the end, Ted's sage political instincts and steadfast commitment to socialism, as well as his rousing oratory, were an enormous inspiration to a generation of socialist activists, including myself. Ted encouraged me to stand as chair of the CLP and was a constant source of advice, counsel, direction throughout. He'll remain the voice in my head, instructing me in the unforgettable way that I'm sure we all knew Ted had the ability to do. Ted's commitment, just as a small anecdote, Ted's commitment to the cause couldn't have been more aptly surmised by a very rare occasion when he was late to a meeting of our EC, the Executive Committee in Dawn. Ted arrived about 30 minutes late to the meeting, coming in and giving his apologies, but he then went on to explain he'd just been in a car accident on the way over, and at 86, Ted had stayed to ensure that all were safe and well, walked the remaining distance to the meeting, sat down, and within 5 minutes launched into an unforgettable Ted Knight speech about the need for the local party to be much more involved in local campaigns and the need to pressure the council in areas where we thought that they weren't doing well enough. You know, Ted Knight was a tour de force to the very end of his life, and he will be sorely, sorely missed in Dulwich and West Norwood, as well as by the Labour movement and all of the activists locally that he inspired so much, including myself. He was a great man, and I'm really, really going to miss him.
Sam, that is wonderful. Thank you very, very much. And the next person to speak is Paul. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Bill. So I first got to know Ted in the early 1980s when he was the leader of Lambeth Council and I was the local government correspondent for a paper called The Newsline, which, as some of you will know, was published by the Workers' Revolutionary Party. It was the beginning of a long political association that endured through thick and thin, with tumultuous events testing both of us. He proved the stronger of the two because he never stepped back from a battle, whereas I may have done from time to time. He was unflinching. Ted, as many have remarked, was a tower of strength and principles. It's worth asking where he might have got that resolve from, because none of us are born that way. Perhaps we should look to his mother's life for the steel that made Ted who he was. She was born Eleanor Maud Gray in South Shields, where shipbuilding, fishing, and local coal mines dominated at that period in 1908. Ted went to stay with her parents as an evacuee during the war. After making her way to London, Eleanor married Edward Austin Knight and settled in Lambeth. After the war, she worked in the new National Health Service and became a shop steward. Her husband, who was still in the Navy, had already encouraged the 12-year-old schoolboy known as Ted Knight to hand out leaflets urging people to vote Labour in the July 1945 election. So Ted's background was a strong one, where struggle for socialist change was the norm. As some of you will know, Ted spent his youth and early adult life in the fledgling British Trotskyist movement. The group we worked with was inside the Labour Party and organised around the paper Socialist Outlook. We boasted connections with people like Michael Foot and Aaron Bevan. It was not enough to prevent Ted from being expelled in 1954, along with his mother. And one of his other crimes was apparently to organise a meeting on the abolition of the monarchy. So Ted remained, after this expulsion, he remained in the Trotskyist movement, spending some time as a full-time organiser in Glasgow until he left in the 1960s, the early 1960s. He then became Secretary of Lewisham Trades Council, was an active member of the Shop Workers Union Usdaw, and after many unsuccessful appeals, he finally was able to persuade the NEC to let him back into the Labour Party in 1970. He would go on to lead what Jeremy Corbyn has described as a legendary struggle against Thatcher's spending cuts. But there was all sorts of things. So in 1981, he gave an interview to a magazine. He said, at the interview with the NEC, I mentioned very firmly that I was a Marxist, that Marxism was a legitimate tendency within the working class movement, and that Marxists have the right to be inside the broad party of the working class. That was his view then, and that was his view when he passed away. He would no doubt have a smile on his face when if he was able to learn that today is the 150th anniversary of one of his heroes, Lenin, the birthday, and Ted had a framed portrait of Lenin in his very small office in Gypsy Hill, along with some other people, including Rodney Bickerstaff and others like that. One of Ted's many strengths was his ability to develop his thinking as the world changed around us. He set out to understand the new forms of capitalism like global financial markets, the giant corporations, and how the state and political parties had adapted to the new world order. Naturally, he was exultant when Jeremy became leader of the Labour Party and his close comrade John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor. Last year's defeat hit him particularly hard because of his age. But he bounced back. Shortly before he died, he had started a conversation with local comrades about building a citizens' assembly in Lambeth to lead the fight back, drawing on his work in chairing the Croydon Assembly. Witty, courteous, firm, generous with his time when it came to others, his death is a grievous and substantial blow. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Susan Millman, if Susan is here. Sorry.
We're going to take Dan before Susan. I got the order wrong.
No, the other way around, please. Me first.
Okay. Sorry, you first. I got it wrong.
That's okay.
I'm asking you to start your video, Sue.
Have you got me?
Excellent.
Hi. Firstly, my thanks to you two, Bill and Paul, for organising this so promptly. A comrade from Hackney North Labour Party sent me condolences. He wrote, during the miners' strike and the rate capping battles of 1984-5, I came to know Ted a bit, and he was certainly one of the shrewdest and most determined operators I've come across on the left. I would very occasionally see him at LRC meetings in the past decade, where he remained an eloquent and passionate advocate of principled positions on resisting austerity. My last encounter with him was at a garden party fundraiser in Gypsy Hill a couple of summers ago, which led me to realise he was also a warm and caring human being, something I'd not appreciated more than 30 years before. I think already we've had from the contributions made some insights into that warm and caring human being. Ted and I first met on MSF London Regional Council 30 years ago. I knew his history and reputation, and then, a young activist, I was quite intimidated. This lessened over time, partly because he was always so impeccably polite and formal and friendly. Though he never suffered foolish views gladly, he had the capacity to divorce the views from the person. Which is not to say that he couldn't demolish somebody's views and consequently them too in a single sentence. Although MSF's London Regional Council became staunchly left, the union nationally under Roger Lyons wasn't, and Ted's annual conference visits to the rostrum were frequent and passionate and very often pivotal. By 2008, the mergers which took MSF into Amicus and on to Unite, and the advent of my family, resulted in a reduction of my union activism. As the war in Iraq had already precipitated my departure from the Labour Party, for 6 years or so, Ted and I seldom met. Pat and Jim Mortimer were comrades and friends from MSF London Regional Council and also belonged to Ted's union branch. Following Jim's death, Pat was supported by a number of comrades, with Ted playing an increasingly active role. Eventually, he was visiting her almost weekly and helping her manage her affairs. From time to time, Ted would gently remind me that I too should be playing my part in Pat's social life, and I would collect him from Gypsy Hill for an afternoon of political discussion at Pat's flat and on the journey to and fro. Soon we were joined on these trips by my husband Alan and my son Daniel, then just becoming a teenager. Always keen on a project, Ted set about the political education of Daniel with a vengeance. The journeys would inevitably involve him recounting an episode from his history, the rate capping years or his parliamentary campaign, all for Dan's benefit, but to Alan and my fascination. Over time, things shifted, and eventually it became a joke between all of us that Ted had assumed the role of adopted grandfather. As I look back over my emails and text exchanges with him, I find they divide neatly into 3 areas. Advice to me on navigating being the chair of my constituency, Hackney North and Stoke Newington. Articles he felt would interest me, and grandfatherly correspondence relating to Dan. Making arrangements to take him to this or that event, requests for suggestions for birthday or Christmas presents, or arrangements for him coming to watch Dan in school drama performances, where once I heard him introduce himself as Dan's grandfather with a twinkle in his eye. When Dan became heavily involved in the Extinction Rebellion movement a year ago, Ted was concerned and couldn't resist the grandfatherly advice coupled with the political analysis, which I know he delivered to Dan on several occasions. He wrote, Dan now has to get the academic qualifications and begin building up his theoretical understanding of why he's a socialist and how the transformation to a new society can be made. This last week of rebellion will have shown him that it's possible to build a movement to enable that change. But he must remember that what he's seen is only the periphery of state power. The state was dealing with a peaceful demonstration, but bigger than they've experienced previously. This operation that Dan was part of was aimed at persuading and building awareness. Very important, but not a battle for power. That, in the end, must take place. But excellent training. Give him a hug from me. On a number of occasions, Ted thanked me for introducing him to Dan. I don't come across many people as young as Dan, you see. They do see things very differently, don't they? Comrades, the honour and pleasure of welcoming Ted into our family was all ours. The last time we saw Ted was 2 weeks before he died, when we gave him a lift from Gypsy Hill to Pat Mortimer's 98th birthday party. She's asked me to say the following. I have known Ted Knight for over 30 years. I would like to thank him for the considerable contribution he made to left politics in both the Labour Party and the trade union movement. He was branch secretary of the union that Jim and I belonged to, and we were all friends. We have had many lively political conversations. He never gave up, right to the end of his life. And neither should we, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That's really moving. Paul, do we go on to Kevin next?
No, I think next is Dan. Dan is next. And then, but I've got a few more tributes to read out quickly.
Yes, please.
And then there's, I think Dan is next, and then Kevin.
So we can see and hear Dan.
Okay, so David Ash, who worked with Ted in Croydon, said, I had the privilege, along with my family and other members of the Keep Our St Helier Hospital campaign, of attending meetings Ted chaired to draft the health section of the Croydon Manifesto. Thanks to Ted, much of that document was adopted as Labour policy under Jeremy Corbyn and was incorporated in the manifesto. I remember Ted saying after a period of illness that he intended to keep on fighting at least until he had a cup of tea with Jeremy at number 10. How tragic they have both been denied that well-deserved experience. How tragic also that we have all been denied the more equal, fairer and happier society Ted would have helped Jeremy to build. We owe it to Ted to redouble our efforts and keep fighting until we achieve what he spent his life fighting for. I've got a couple more for later.
Thank you, Paul. Over to Dan, please.
Thank you. Many people knew Ted the politician or Ted the operator. I knew Ted the grandfather. Ted was my grandfather, albeit an adopted one. However, that did not compromise the love that we had for one another. He honoured the role to its fullest and was overjoyed when my mum christened him with the title. I assure you that Ted took his grandfather responsibilities very seriously. He counselled me upon the teachings of Marx and Lenin, although I'm not sure that would fall into the usual job description of grandfather. However, he also fulfilled the usual grandfather duties of coming to see me in my school performances and giving me his personal copy of the Communist Manifesto for my 17th birthday. And on the inside cover, he wrote, "A useful book to remind you what the struggle for socialism is really about." More recently, for my 18th birthday, at my request, he gave me John Berco's autobiography, writing that 4 years before John Bercow was a Conservative councillor on Lambeth Council, when I was leader, he claims that his voice was continually heard, but I find that I have to remind people that he was actually a councillor. His fame undoubtedly came later as the Speaker of the House of Commons. In years to come, if you should be looking at this book again, I hope it may remind you of an old friend who loved you very much. But Ted also went above and beyond what was expected of him as a grandfather, as a friend, grandfather, politician, or mentor. We attended my first Labour Party annual conference together in 2018, and he coached me prior to my entering the infamous 6-hour Brexit compositing meeting, which conceived the notorious all options on the table. He took me as his guest to John's Shadow Chancellor reception following his keynote speech in 2018. He invited me to accompany him to Parliament and watch Prime Minister's questions, followed by having lunch on the terrace. He even arranged for Jeremy to bump into me outside the House of Commons. He gifted me knowledge, experiences and memories that I will treasure for the rest of my life. October 2019, Trafalgar Square. I was sat atop a scaffold tower at an Extinction Rebellion protest, shouting to the masses gathered below. We had successfully blockaded the entirety of Westminster. The government were now in negotiations with us to open the roads so that MPs could get in to vote. Meanwhile, Ted was sat at home exchanging frantic and panicked texts with my mum. She sent him link after link to videos on Twitter of me on my tower rallying the troops. A short 24 hours later, after I had been sent to Fresh Wharf Police Station in Barking, I was on the phone to Ted. He was anxious to know that I was not going to abandon the cause of socialism and fighting the greatest evil in the climate crisis of capitalism, that I would not take my eye off the ball, because Ted never took his eye off the ball. He never forgot what the fight was about. Ted taught me many things. He spoke frankly about death and did not fear it. He told me I had to speak at this meeting. He was completely committed to the cause. Ted dedicated his life to socialism. If any one of us can make even a shed of the impact that Ted made, then we have been a success. We cannot let Ted's battles die with him. We must carry on fighting the valiant battles that he fought his entire life. Ted always had a thirst to learn. It was unquenchable. He would always graciously order the same thing as myself on the menu, despite me being a vegetarian. He would want to talk with me for hours on end, over countless meals and drinks and books. We would discuss the complexities of the modern queer community, Extinction Rebellion, and my own school life. He wanted to know about my degree and what I would be learning. It is with his thirst for knowledge that we should go forward in life. It is with his strength and determination that I will continue fighting. When people say we stand on the shoulders of giants, it means we stand on the shoulders of the likes of Ted. Ted was a giant. I love you, friend. I miss you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
So over, I think, to Kevin now. So Kevin, I've unmuted you. Can you turn your video on, please?
Hopefully.
There you are.
There you are, Kevin.
Am I here?
You're there.
Can you see me?
Yep.
Oh, hang on, let's just get rid of that. Right, good evening. I'm Kevin, I'm from Croydon Trade Union Council. I have to say that, you know, I kind of felt that Ted was always going to be around. Ted was always there. He was always dedicated and polite, and all the things we've heard other people say. So it came as a bit of a shock when I kind of read of his passing. I remember Ted from the Trades Council in Croydon, and he was always active, and he was always active in terms of national and international subjects, and it was always about caring about people and socialism. But my real involvement with Ted came about 5 years or so ago, when he turned up at a Trades Council meeting with the idea of setting up the Croydon Assembly. And we had a good debate about it, and we thought, well, maybe it would happen, maybe it wouldn't. But Ted was the person who made it work. Ted was a dedicated person who intent on putting forward ideas would make sure that they carried forward. And I can remember him having meetings with lots of people from lots of areas, which is partly why he set it up, because he wanted to get people to buy into politics again. And lots of people came along and put their views forward in terms of how they wanted the assembly meetings to be run. And you know, Ted listened to everybody there. And although he listened to people and took on board what they were saying, he was always aiming to what he believed to be the right thing. And eventually it came to pass that we had the meetings, and Ted, as was said earlier, you know, he was a polite person, and we're standing at the front of Ruskin House, and we're kind of an hour before the meeting started. And at that point, Ted started to get nervous. We had a discussion about, well, what if nobody turns up? And it was, well, I'm sure somebody will turn up. I'm sure that it will be the case. And by the time it started, we had a pretty full hall, and it was people from all over the place who turned up to discuss it. He ran that meeting, and his dedication, and one of his fiery speeches, as I think Judy said earlier on, which always inspired and brought people forward. He encouraged people to be involved. He wanted people to be active, and that's what he did. And he always did it with a politeness that was there. I also remember we had a meeting in Croydon with a guest speaker, and the guest speaker didn't turn up. And kind of, I'm sitting there thinking, well, maybe we'll pack up and go home. Ted said, we will do it, and we will have a discussion here. And you know what? We did. And it was one of the best meetings we ever had. And that was inspired and encouraged by Ted. I actually believe that Ted was always there. And for the Trades Council, he always turned up, even when his health was not brilliant. He was always there to encourage and wanting to reinvigorate the Trades Council. And whenever he was called upon, he always gave a rousing speech. The movement will be a lot worse off his passing. And on a personal note, I will miss him loads. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So I'm going to say just a few words.
Bill, before you do it,
turning up first.
Just let me say the last couple of tributes, and then over to you, Bill.
So on my list, we've heard everybody. So you're going to read out some tributes.
The last two, Bill, and then we can then.
Okay, off you go.
Okay, so this one is from Corinna Lotz. It says, Ted radiated confidence. His immaculate attire, jacket, tie, and freshly ironed shirt projected a sense of alertness. He combined this with punctuality, meticulous and systematic preparation for whatever he did. He had an unfailing sense of courtesy and appreciation for his comrades, plus a wicked sense of humour. He refused to allow, hang on a second. He refused to allow issues with sight, hearing, or mobility to hold him back. He learned to use the internet, social media, and emails. He kept closely informed on political developments, shrewdly evaluating them, always from the perspective of building the movement for the main prize, the transfer of power from capitalism to the majority in society. Last one, very brief, Johnny Byrne, who knew him in the T&G Amicus Broad Left at the time of the formation of Unite, and more recently as a friend of Pat Mortimer, said of Ted, he was an unwavering socialist, always ready with a wise and practical advice kindly given. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, done, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my name's Bill Bowring. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction. I was one of the surcharge councillors in Lambeth, and I had the honour to be a Lambeth councillor for 8 years. I'm going to start slightly earlier, though, which is 1966, when I first campaigned for the Labour Party and joined. That was Harold Wilson's second election, and I still have a copy of the national plan of the Labour Party. It was a slightly different Labour Party at that time. And I did have a short detour through Trotskyism, so I was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party from 1969 to 1974. And Ted was not a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party at that time. Indeed, he was mentioned as a kind of a traitor to the Workers' Revolutionary Party because he decided to become very active in the Labour Party and Labour movement generally. So I can confirm over quite a few years of knowing Ted that he was most certainly a Marxist, no question about that at all, and that he would have a portrait of Lenin in his office. That is Ted. I never once heard him mention the name Trotsky, by the way. When it is said that he was a Trotskyist, actually, I think that is a mistake. And what Ted was a municipal socialist. And he was a municipal socialist in the model of, amongst other people, George Lansbury and the popular councillors who went to prison themselves in the early 1920s over an issue of rates. And indeed, when we marched to the High Court to hear ourselves described by judges of the High Court as the pinnacle of political perversity, we marched under our banner, but also a replica of the popular councillors' banner when they were sent to prison. Of course, the intention of Thatcher was not to send us to prison, that was the last thing she wanted, but to bankrupt us in the way that the Clay Cross councillors had previously been bankrupted. And indeed, we would have been bankrupted had it not been for fantastic support from the Labour and trade union movement. Going back just a few years, I moved to Lambeth in 1975. And I was at that time, having found that wandering around doing jobs like paper factory and Dover docks and that kind of thing was not getting anywhere. And I started training to be a barrister. And I started advising at the Brixton Advice Centre in Railton Road in Brixton. And in particular, got involved in the squatters movement. And when I became a barrister, I was their barrister. And it was they who encouraged me to get back into the Labour Party and to stand as a councillor. And initially, I was turned down by the leadership in London on the basis that I'd been a Trotskyist. But after an appeal, I was allowed to stand in the council elections in 1978. And I immediately came into a major conflict with Ted. Ted being a municipal socialist, to him the squatters were anathema, really. And that was the days of Villa Road and St Agnes Place and the gay squat in Railton Road. And so the first couple of years on the council were conflict with Ted, and he's really quite an opponent. However, when Thatcher came to power, 1982, the end of council housing, and the rate capping and the cuts during the middle of the 1980s. And when Thatcher, having won the Malvinas War by a hair's breadth, decided to get on with her original plan of smashing the trade unions and smashing local government, both of which she had made quite clear was what she intended to do. Of course, in 1986, the GLC was abolished, and we came into our own fight with Thatcher. And initially, we should remember that people like David Blunkett and Margaret Hodge and people like this were on our side. There was a united front, and all of these Labour councils were going to refuse to set a rate. One by one, they all dropped out. And Ken Livingstone dropped out. That was the point at which John McDonnell, who's going to be speaking in a moment, was sacked from a large number of jobs by Ken Livingstone. And in the end, it was us and Liverpool standing. And Ted led the council in the most remarkable way. I mean, so it was force of personality, it was his conviction, it was his political training of people on the council. And we had Lloyd Leon, the first black mayor in the country, in Lambeth. And actually, we had a couple of people did drop out. There were two other barristers who were council members. We were mostly working class councillors. And one of them ended up as the barrister for Lady Porter when she was surcharged herself for gerrymandering in the city of Westminster, one of Thatcher's best friends. So there was some poetic justice in that one. And then over the years, I moved to Colchester, where I still am. But it was really great being in contact with Ted, particularly through the Labour Representation Committee. And we're going to miss him so much. I just wanted to mention one other thing. When I really got to know Ted quite well, we went to Moscow together because Lambeth was not only twinned with Bluefields in Nicaragua, but with Moskvoretsky Rayon in Moscow. And I must say, the Soviets found Ted as a Marxist really quite uncomfortable. I don't think there were any Marxists left in the Soviet Union at that time. But Ted definitely made a big impression. But going to Nicaragua with him was just a tremendous, the solidarity there was a tremendous experience. So I'm going to miss him extremely badly, and hard to think that he isn't there anymore. So thank you very much, and it's a great honor and privilege. By the way, I'm going to let a few more people in, sorry. We now have 76 people, and this is the Labour movement. I think it's really very moving seeing all the comrades here on the screen. Thank you very much.
So Bill, we now have John and Jeremy, and they have to decide who's going to go next to close us out. So John, Jeremy.
Hello.
Yeah, who is that?
Take John then me, if you whichever way you want.
Okay, John, over to you.
Okay, I'm trying to start the video.
Okay.
This is the host has stopped it. Here we go.
There you go. You're on.
Ah, there you are. Okay. Look, it's been moving. It's been absolutely moving listening to everyone's recollections of Ted, and I think we all come to the same conclusion. Really, he was, for most of us, it was everything you wanted in a friend. Everything you wanted in a friend. Absolutely loyal and warm and humorous, and always there whenever you needed him. Always there. Never let anybody down. And I God knows what we're going to do in the future, because I really will miss him. I just miss him. He was an honest friend as well. He was always straight with you when he thought you were doing the right thing. He'd support you and he'd put his hand in the fire for you. When he thought you weren't doing exactly as he thought was the right, he was straight with you. He always did. And he used to turn up at Portcullis House with Nick Toms and Paul and provide me with a critique of what we were doing in terms of Jeremy and my own role in the Labour Party, and what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong, and what we should be doing, and what the analysis was. I just loved him for it, because the thing I liked was that he was the one person I could always trust to tell me straight what was up and what he judged was the right way forward. And I'm going to miss that terribly. He was a permanent fixture in my life for over 40 years, and there was never a time when I didn't, if I needed him at any time, he'd be at the end of a phone, or he'd be willing to rush up and meet me, and I do the same for him. So he's just everything you want in a friend. That's the first thing. But the second thing, I think for most of us, he embodied exactly what a socialist activist should be. Absolutely committed, but he embodied for me the Marxist concept of praxis. He was a theoretician. He understood Marxist theory and could communicate it effectively, but also in his whole life was about putting that into practice. And that's what he did so effectively. He took theory and he demonstrated what class struggle was all about. Someone said earlier he was a class fighter. He was a superb class fighter because he was able to explain the world so coherently. People have said what an oratory was. I think people underestimated just what an oratory was and how through his oratory he convinced people of all generations and brought them. And remember, that was in a political climate at times when he had, just as many of us had, but him on a scale not many have experienced, the whole of the media against him. And I can remember as well going to Labour Party conferences and meetings and trade union meetings where he's got up and you already had people braying for his blood before he even spoke. And yet he saw that through determination and through his oratory got the message across. And actually, as I say, I think he convinced large numbers of people about the relevance and importance of socialism, but also he convinced a large number of people about how you go about it in practice, how you build campaigns, how you organize, and then how you convince people about what the next steps are in any particular struggle. And as I say, that was for generations, for absolute generations. And what's interesting, what everyone has said as well, is even when Ted had a disagreement with someone used the word impeccable, he was impeccable in his manners. He was impeccable in the way in which he dealt with people, always with at times it would annoy me, but always with a politeness and a generosity of spirit that some people actually didn't deserve. But he always thought that was his style, because I just think he embodied for me a lot of what humanity is all about. Generous to a fault, both in terms of whatever he could do for people, but generous to a fault with his time and commitment as well. And again, had no material interest in the world, none at all. Everything was about the movement for socialism, and he devoted his life to it. And at times as well, I thought, how's he surviving on so little at times? But it was through dedication as much as anything. And that's what I think we all admired him for. It was just, as I say, he embodied everything you'd want in a friend, that generosity, kindness, humour, commitment, all of those things. But as a socialist activist, I can think of no better. Theoretical, put it into practice, but an organisational skill, but also with an element of bite as well, to be honest. We all have our anecdotes about Ted, and some of them are just amazing. When I was on the GLC, obviously we worked closely together and into the rate capping campaigns, and sometimes I'd get frustrated. And on one year, we had to put what they call a money bill through Parliament. So to get our capital resources for the year, we'd have to put a piece of legislation through Parliament. And there was a group of Tories who were trying to block our money bill. So I invented this concept of positive victimisation, so that if any Tory MP in London voted against our money bill, I said we wouldn't spend any money in their constituencies. I did that at 11 o'clock. By 1 o'clock, I had to reverse the policy because Ted had hit the airwaves saying this was ludicrous because I've got a Tory MP in Lambeth. And it was just amazing. And it was just brilliant. And I don't know, there's so many anecdotes. I can remember when we were on Labour Herald and we're on the editorial board of Labour Herald, we had rallies at Labour Party conference. And those rallies, I can remember we had 2,000 people at a rally at Labour Party conference. It was unheard of until Jeremy Corbyn got elected, and then 2,000 became a regular occurrence. And one of the rallies we had first of all, we had on the platform a guy called Tommy Carroll who just, he was in the Irish struggles and he'd just been released from prison after serving about 12 years. He was on the platform, and then we had a Palestinian speaker, but the security with the Palestinian speaker said, could he sit in the audience and speak from there, because they were worried about a sniper, would you believe? And then halfway through the meeting, we had unfortunately, the police contacted the hall and said there'd been a bomb scare, a bomb threat. And I said to Ted, look, I think we're going to have to abandon the meeting. And in true form, Ted said, well, let's finish off with the speakers at least. And are you sure everyone's paid their subs before they came in? And eventually we did have to abandon the meeting. But Ted then organised people outside. So we held the meeting in the street. It was just unbelievable. It's just classic Ted night, it really was. And there's so many stories about it on so many demonstrations and so many picket lines. And of course, the Lambeth rate capping struggle. And as Bill has said, you know, they were heroes. When others gave up the struggle, when others didn't have the courage that Ted and Bill and the others demonstrated and portrayed, he stuck at it, and yes, did risk everything, actually did risk all the surcharges and bankruptcies, etc. But he had confidence in the labour and trade union movement would rally round, and we did. But it was absolute courage, and it inspired people for future generations as well. And as people write the history of the left in this country, Ted will be a significant part of that history for the last century, certainly, in the role that he played in rate capping and the role that he played in developing the concept, as Bill has said, of municipal socialism on from the popular councillors, and demonstrated just how in one local authority, how actually you can implement a programme of policies that can transform people's lives. And yes, exactly as Sam has said, on a number of those issues, they were, you know, miles ahead of their time, certainly with regard to women's rights and LGBT rights, and the way in which you engage the community in developing community life and policies for them, and making sure that you hold your elected representatives to account, was light years ahead of its time. And we've learned a lot of lessons from what Ted did then, and what at that time, if you remember, the media and others were condemning him for. So I'll miss him. I'll miss him. I'll miss him tremendously. I'm just so grateful that we became friends, and I'm so grateful for the contribution that he made to our labour and trade union movement, not just in Lambeth, not just in Croydon. Right to the end, I was speaking. I only spoke at one of his meetings, his rallies, only a few months ago, which he chaired with his usual assertive discipline of chairing a meeting, and it was packed and it was great, and it was, again, he organised it to lift people up after the campaigning that we'd done and the setbacks, some of the setbacks we've had recently. But I just think he's made such a significant contribution to our movement that his memory will last. The lessons he's taught us will certainly last. But I'll always remember him for his warmth as a human being. He gave his life to the best cause he possibly could of humanity, but he also gave to all of us as his friends that warmth of spirit that he always had. And I'll carry that forward with me, and the lessons that he taught me, I think I have a responsibility to him now to try and pass that on as much as I possibly can to the next generation, that understanding of how the world is. And exactly as Paul said, he always was able to learn lessons himself and learn through his studies as well, and update ideas and theories, etc., and always have that energy to be able to do that. And I think that responsibility to Ted's memory is to make sure we do exactly the same. We follow in the footprints, as I say, of someone who embodied for me exactly what a socialist activist should be. Thanks, Bill. Bill, I think you're muted.
You're muted, Bill.
Okay. Jeremy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me, Bill?
We can hear you very well.
Lovely. It's very hard to follow everything that John has said because it was so brilliant, and I agree with it all. I'm getting used to these Zoom calls where I see John McDonnell in a red sweater with a Liverpool scarf behind him all the time. I knew Ted very, very well for many years. I first met him in the 1970s in the London Labour Party, and he stood out as somebody of passion, of determination, of knowledge, of intelligence, and above all, of principle. And then in 1976, he was selected as the Labour candidate for Hornsey, where I was the agent. And there never was a more determined candidate. There never was somebody more dedicated to the responsibilities of being the candidate in a Tory-held marginal. And he was there all the time, whilst also a councillor, and then during that time became leader of Lambeth Council. And he was somebody in those days who smoked like a chimney, and wasn't a particularly fit-looking individual. And I was interested in his reaction when I announced that one of the first things he would be doing as a candidate was a sponsored walk around the boundaries of the constituency the whole way. Ted did it, of course. He cursed me the whole way. He cursed the route. He cursed the idea, but he was determined he would do it because we had asked him to do it. And as our parliamentary candidate, when the National Front, the fascists, tried to march along Wood Green High Road in 1977, Bernie Grant and myself and others organised a big demonstration to try and stop the NF. Ted was there, of course, speaking out against the fascists and supporting the community in organising against them. We were, by the way, told by people in the Labour Party head office to cancel our demonstration, to not get involved in it, and just let the National Front go by because nobody would ever take any notice of them. Ted, myself, Bernie and others took a very, very different view, of course, and we stood up against them, as did the entire community. So Ted as candidate was there supporting the then strikes organised by the National Union of Public Employees. I was an official of the union at that time, and there was no more reliable supporter of our campaign for decent wages for street cleaners, refuse workers, school meals workers, cleaners, and all the other people that were so grotesquely underpaid at that time, and indeed many, sadly, who still are. And so I want to say thank you to Ted for those years and all he did. But in leading Lambeth, he showed us what municipal socialism could be. He showed us the importance of bringing services in-house and making sure that they delivered. And he showed us the ability to stand up against the Tory government. And I became an MP in 1983 and saw then what the right of the Labour Party were doing in condemning him, in failing to support the miners' strike, and indeed failing to support the GLC, which at that time stood alongside what Ted was doing. So I want to say a big thank you to Ted for his principles, the way he stood up for people, but also he had this reputation which was really nonsense, that he was this hard, horrible man that would sort of chew your head off, chew your ears off and spit them out for breakfast or something. He was actually the most polite, respectful individual there ever was, very determined in his politics, very principled in his politics, an absolutely brilliant speaker. But he was also a very polite, very respectful individual, and it was a pleasure for me to work with him. And when he led the fight against rate capping and against what the Thatcher government was doing, eventually, as John said, Lambeth ended up being isolated from the other councils along with Liverpool. But what he was doing was arguing for the principle of proper funding for local government in exactly the same way that George Lansbury had done in the 1920s and 1930s over the funding of councils in the East End. And Ted was making the absolutely correct point that boroughs such as Lambeth, which had a lower rate base than others, were getting very unfairly treated by a Tory government. And he stood up for that principle of fairness in local government and the ability to develop things. But what was different about Ted was that he took the community with him. He argued for community involvement and action in what the council was doing. He worked alongside trade unions, and he saw that community strength in our party. And so when I was nominated to be a candidate for leader of the party in 2015, Ted was on the phone immediately offering any support necessary, and he did an incredible amount in that campaign. And in the very difficult time in 2016, when there was a challenge made, and we again had another election campaign, which we won a year later. And there was nobody happier than Ted at the result of that election campaign. And as leader of the party, Ted would often come and talk to me. He'd often complain it was very hard to get to see me, and then go over that, and we'd get on with a very nice cup of tea and a discussion. And I'd got so much respect for him. And John's right. If he didn't agree with what you were doing, he would say so, but in a very polite and respectful way, and didn't hector or shout. He'd just say, well, I think you should do so and so differently. And I would say, thank you very much. Let's think about how we're doing things and what we can do. But this is the overall objective, what we're trying to achieve. A Labour Party rooted and strong in the community, that speaks for and represents the community and empowers people to challenge the grotesque levels of inequality and injustice within our society. And Ted was all of that. And I think with all the current talk about what's happening within the party, Ted would smile a little, because I remember in 1970 something, we were both summoned to Transport House. It was the Labour Party office, because they said they'd had complaints about Ted. Complaints came from people, by the way, who later went on to join the SDP. And as we went into the then National Agent's office, he had 2 folders on his desk. And I said, what are those? And there was one that was very big and one that was a bit smaller. And I said, what are those? And he said, well, the one here, the big one, that's the file on Ted Knight's activities we've been keeping ever since the 1940s. And I said, the other one? He said, it's yours. It's only smaller because you're a bit younger than Ted. And they had these letters and press cuttings and everything else of a sort of monitoring exercise against individuals in the party. Anyway, nothing came of the complaints. Ted was endorsed as our candidate for Hornsey, and we fought that campaign. And so Ted believed in the Labour movement, believed in trade unions, believed in socialism, believed in the ability of people to organise together and be strong. And I've got a book he gave me about the Lambeth campaign, a photo montage of the Lambeth campaign. It's got Ted and others in it. And I want to just say thank you to Ted for being a great mate and a great friend, and for somebody that you could always rely on to stick to the principles that he'd always held and take those through in his life. And I'm going to miss Ted a lot, but you know what? We're all going to be very strong. And this COVID issue now has shown up just how dangerous inequality is across the planet, and how much inequality in this country means. It's the poorest communities in the poorest places breathing the foulest air that suffer the most. Surely to goodness, we need the strongest possible socialist movement to challenge that inequality, challenge that injustice, and help people to get to a better place and a better and fairer society. Ted taught us a lot, and he was a great friend to all of us, and it's been inspiring listening to all the comments that have been made, and so many were so nice. But I loved the way Dan put it about the way Ted talked to him and tried to support him. Well done, Ted. Thanks.
Jeremy, it's absolutely wonderful that you could be with us, and a good view of your garden at the same time.
And the cat.
Sorry?
And El Gato, who's just on the shed roof behind me.
Oh, great. Okay. So I think that is a really good way to end this meeting, as a matter of fact, and hearing from both you and John McDonnell. And as I said, I mean, this is really so inspiring in any case. 77 people are in this meeting now. And this is really just a splendid cross-section of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. Paul is just going to say a few words about the funeral. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, the comrades, a number of comrades locally have agreed that Ted will be cremated without a service. We don't see the point in having a few people gather and having to sit miles apart and perhaps not turn up because of COVID. So we've decided that Ted will be cremated in the near future, and that will be a public memorial when time allows, and we can all gather together, and others who are unable to speak this evening to pay our, physical personal tribute to Ted, hopefully before the end of this year. So that's the plan. And when a date is available for the cremation, I will email everyone, and you can then take the time for a moment of reflection at the time when this ceremony is to take place. So I will make sure everybody knows when that moment is, probably in early May. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So I've just written thanks to all 77 of you. This has been recorded, so hopefully we will find a way of putting that up. Somebody just asked if you could have the emails of everyone who's at the meeting.